Well, for more insight about China's fight against pollution, we are joined by energy expert Jeffrey Ball from Stanford University. Thanks for joining us, Jeffrey. What do you think is really driving this change to tax companies, plants, based on how much they pollute?
Well, I think two things are driving this. First, as your piece just reported, are the really extensive and deep environmental problems that pervade China. Everything from dirty air to dirty water to rising mounds of trash. And indeed, I think it was that last bit, the rising mounds of trash particularly, that was an impetus for this rule. So that's one thing, is just the extent of environmental problems, and that is becoming an economic and potentially political problem in China that everyone in the power structure in China, I think, wants to address. The other is an economic motive, and that is there's an increasing realization in China that despite the great riches that the country has, it needs to shepherd that money more efficiently by the admission of very senior people in the country, and that China needs to figure out a more efficient way to deal with a whole host of issues that are facing the country, including environmental problems. And so to the extent that the country is able, rather than having to burden taxpayers with the cost of cleanups, to shift the cost of those cleanups onto the perpetrators, that's a much more efficient way to do it. Of course, the question is, can that be done? Can that be enforced? What's the process by which that'll happen? And that's really what's going to be interesting, I think, to watch moving forward.
And you asked a lot of the questions I was going to actually ask you. So do crackdowns, in your opinion, like fining people or taxing them, is that an efficient and effective way to make the air cleaner? Does it work?
Well, it's certainly a tradition that has been in effect elsewhere in the world, in much of the rest of the world. So, for instance, in the United States and Europe, what's called the polluter pays principle has been an established part of law for a long time. I'm sitting here in California in the United States, and the United States has had, for instance, on the books for a long time, something called a Superfund law, in which industries pay into a fund, and if there are found to be egregious violations, egregious environmental spills, or that sort of thing, either the perpetrator, the company that's behind the spill, pays for it, or if that's not found to be possible for whatever reason, then the fund pays for it. And again, that fund comes not from tax money, but from contributions from an industry. So the design here is to increase the incentive for industry to do the right thing environmentally rather than to do the wrong thing environmentally. Another example of this, and China is considering this as we speak, just as the United States is and as Europe is in a broader sense, is a tax on emissions of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, to the extent that companies that emit greenhouse gas are forced to pay a tax for emitting that. That's essentially a polluter pays principle. And so absolutely it's been shown to have an effect. But again, politically, it's often very difficult to impose. Particularly, it's difficult to impose when there's no tradition of that in a country.
And why do you think these companies ignore these strict environmental protections? Is it, at the end of the day, is it about money? Is it about weak enforcement?
Well, look, I don't think the answer to that question is any different in China than it is in the United States or in Europe or anywhere else in the world. I think it's almost certainly absolutely about money. If one can get away with it, then it's less expensive to get away with it than it is to change one's practices to adhere to environmental rules. And the game here is to, first of all, make it so expensive to commit these infractions that it's more expensive to commit them than it is to change corporate practices to avoid committing them. And secondly, often to impose fines that are so significant that if you're caught violating the rules, not only do you have to pay for the cleanup, but you have to pay a fine on top of that, which makes it doubly pricey, so that everyone thinks twice about this.
All right, we'll leave it there. Fascinating discussion. Jeffrey Ball, much appreciated. Thank you.
Nice to be with you.